Hello and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. My name is Mara Zarka, and I'm a research associate and project manager at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. It is my distinct pleasure to be moderating today's session. The event is inspired by a series of closed seminars organized by the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium, of which VCDNP is a member, that focuses on artificial intelligence and different weapons categories. The VCDNP thanks the consortium for its support in also offering a public webinar to cover this important and timely topic. Rapid advancements in artificial intelligence, or AI, are already transforming military tactics on the battlefield. This can be seen in the use of intelligence applications to select targets, the deployment of uncrewed vehicles, and for more administrative purposes such as logistics assistance or optimization of equipment maintenance. While AI is not new, the speed at which it is developing presents new challenges. To try to ensure that AI is developed, deployed, and used in a safe and secure manner, especially in the military domain, several initiatives have been introduced. One such effort is the Political Declaration on the Responsible Military Use of AI and Autonomy that was presented at the Responsible Artificial Intelligence in the Military Domain Conference in February 2023 and now has over 50 signatories. In this webinar, our speakers, whom I will introduce in just a moment, will discuss efforts like the Political Declaration along with others and provide an overview of the different types of AI technology, the legal framework, especially in the context of international humanitarian law, and ethical aspects of using AI in the military domain. Before I introduce them, I will go over a few housekeeping items. First, please note that this webinar will be recorded. You will find a summary of today's discussion and a recording of the presentations available on our website at www.vcdnp.org a few days following the event. For questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, which you may access at the bottom of your screens. Please do not submit questions in the chat function. For those of you who are joining us via YouTube, please submit your questions via email to events@vcdnp.org. The inbox will be monitored. We encourage you to submit your questions both during and after the presentations. We will hear all of the presentations before turning to the questions, though. Now, I am pleased to present our excellent panel of speakers in the order in which they will be providing their remarks. We will start with a technical overview provided by Dr. Thomas Reinhold, who is a researcher at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt as part of the Research Cluster for Natural and Technical Science Arms Control Research. He is a computer scientist who has been working on conflicts in cyberspace and measures for arms control of military activities in this domain, as well as the challenges of the militarization of artificial intelligence. We will then turn to the legal perspective provided by Dr. Elisabeth Hoffberger-Pippan, who is a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt, mainly focusing on humanitarian law, arms control, and human rights, with a specific focus on artificial intelligence and military robotics. She is also part of CBWNet, where she explores the norms against biological and chemical weapons. Prior to joining PRIF, she was head of the International Panel on the Regulation of Autonomous Weapons. And then Dr. Alexander Blanchard, who is a senior researcher in the Governance of Artificial Intelligence program at CIPRI, will provide an ethical perspective. His work focuses on issues related to the development, use, and control of military applications of artificial intelligence. His current work focuses on the control of autonomy in weapon systems, as well as organizational practices for the governance of AI. Before joining CIPRI, Alexandra was the Digital Ethics Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute in London. I welcome all of our speakers to today's webinar. I thank you for joining us for today's webinar. And now, without further ado, Dr. Reinhold, the virtual microphone is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for this event. Thank you very much for being able to talk today. I'd like to give you a brief introduction to artificial intelligence in general and the military application in special. The term AI is widely used, so let's start with the definition here. And this is the definition taken from US declaration from end of last year, where they coin artificial intelligence as the ability of machines to perform tasks that would otherwise require human intelligence, which means recognizing patterns, learning from experience, drawing conclusions, making predictions, or generating recommendations. But still, this is a very broad definition, and AI is currently used for as a collective term for a multitude of approaches, which has to do with the long history of AI developments of around, I would say, 80 years. So to give you a bit more understanding, here's the figure I find very helpful. We have this whole set of artificial intelligence, which is everything that somehow mimics human intelligence, human capabilities. And within this set, we have the subset of machine learning, which is a set for all software and hardware related approaches where the machine is actually able to derive rules, patterns, other relations from data without being able to hard code it. And within machine learning, we have the deep learning. Come to that in just a few seconds. And deep learning is the technology that we're hearing about the last 4 years, and which allows us the results we're currently seeing. And within the deep learning set, we have the generative AI, which is probably the most well-known technology, which enables AI to generate images. And I have a few examples on the next slides. So when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're currently talking mainly about neural networks and especially deep neural networks. And the idea is not that new. It has been formulated in 1943 by researchers which thought about recreating the network of neural brain cells and the interconnections. And this approach has been tested over the last decades multiple times, but only in around 2010 we had enough computational power to actually simulate large networks of artificial neurons. And when you're talking about large, I mean tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even millions of thousands. And this was somehow the tipping point that has brought us the capabilities we are currently seeing. And these are the current types of actual current artificial intelligence applications. I think the most eye-catching one is generative AI, like Midjourney, like DALL-E or Sora. These are systems that allows the user to create images from a textual description. And you probably have all seen the images of Trump resisting the police when trying to arrest him, which is totally fake image, but looks photorealistic. Other examples is that an AI is able to generate an image in different art styles of famous artists. The second example you probably all have known about are the so-called large language models like ChatGPT. These are artificial intelligence systems that learned how human sentences are structured, which enables these systems to chat with humans and which allows us to give them a task like create me an invitation for the birthday of my 4-year-old daughter, for instance. And then we have the so-called large multimodal models. This is somehow the combination of the two former approaches, where we not only use text to train the system, the AI, but to use different kind of media to be able to interact with the system. So, for instance, you can take a picture and present the picture to the AI, and the AI is able to describe the picture and what's on it. And before going over to the military perspective, I'd like to give you a brief glimpse how AI will probably evolve. The first thing I already mentioned, we have this different kind of media for learning of the AI, but also for interacting with it. Then we have the foundation models, which is something we already see. Foundation models are so-called pre-trained AIs, which means they are not trained for a specific task, but somehow pre-trained to recognize text, recognize images. And you can take these systems off the shelf, and they are rented, they are bought to sold to customers who take them and then use a second iteration to train the AI for their specific application. And the next steps the AI companies are heading to, and this is somehow a little bit of science fiction, is the so-called artificial general AI, which tries to gain a multi-purpose step. Because current generation AI are always trained for very specific tasks, and when we compare it to humans, we are able to have a conversation with our colleagues while preparing coffee, and even maybe possibly unconsciously thinking about a mathematical problem. And that's somehow something that AI companies are trying to reach. Um, and to other more technical developments, which are probably we'll be talking about later when Elisabeth, my colleague, have the talk, is the so-called explainable AI. This is a technical approach that tries to allows human operators understand the reasoning of the AI, why a specific input leads to a specific output for an AI. And the second more technical step is that where we are currently having interaction mainly with one specific AI, in the near future, we probably will see multiple AI interactions. So we have different AI systems. They are all of them are trained for specific tasks. They interact with each other, even probably iterative interaction to solve a problem. And what's important to keep in the back of your mind is that with every step of new capabilities, the costs to train, to develop, and to operate this AI increase exponentially, which leads us to complete new problems like the availability of processing power, the availability of the necessary power equipment, and the chips. But I promised to talk about the military perspective. And the question is why military forces are interested in AI. And when we're looking at military forces, especially when on military forces in battlefield situations, they have a problem that they have to manage a vast amount of different data from surveillance systems, from weapon systems, from the drones, the satellite images, and so on and so forth. So they need some kind of automated data analysis in order to allow them to filter all these information, pre-process it, and make them usable and handleable for human decision makers. And all in all, what military forces are trying to gain are advantages either in terms of speed or the quality of their decisions. And we already have some AI-enabled applications. One we learned about during the war of Israel against the Hamas system called the Gospel, which is a system for the automated data aggregation and analysis of data for pre-selecting relevant military human targets. Another system is Aegis. Aegis is a marine-based air defense systems, and the manufacturer is promoting system that the newest generation of it is able or is using AI to tracking and to engaging incoming threats for marine vessels. Another system that we learned about, especially during the war in Ukraine, is Palantir. And Palantir, or the CEO of Palantir, is quoted with the sentence that around 80% of the target decisions on Ukraine's side supported by his system. Other examples from the war in Ukraine is AI systems that has been used to live translating the intercepted human Russian army radio communication. And on the Russian side, the loitering ammunition system called Lancet is or should have AI target locking capabilities. But more interesting is, I think, the question where military forces are trying to heading to. And one of the most prominent examples are the so-called battlefield management systems, like, for instance, the US project Convergence. And the idea here is to reduce the sender to shooter time from 20 minutes to 20 seconds. So the time from incoming data, processing data, filtering, making decision and then engaging a target. And when you look on the 22nd, that's the goal, then you can somehow understand how small the role of human decision, human oversight will probably be here. Other examples are, for instance, the US program Loyal Wingman, but also FCAS, which should have AI-enabled aerial support platforms. The DARPA is known for having, for instance, a program to develop automated cyber defense and offense systems. And besides these actual battlefield AI-enabled systems, we also have topics like logistics, like equipment maintenance and prediction, but also recruiting, where AI should boost the capabilities. And of course, then there's also all the whole area of information operations, of deepfakes, so on and so forth. And before coming to the end of my small talk, I'd like to mention one more thing: is it's the autonomy in weapon systems, because this is a huge driver for the AI development. Because autonomous systems usually have to operate in uncertain conditions, which means you need some kind of flexibility for these systems versus strict rules. For instance, if you picture a drone that has to fly from point A to point B, then this drone has to somehow be able to avoid obstacles. And other challenges for such, especially weaponized autonomous systems, are the tracking, the target decision about the power targets, and engaging these targets without or completely or even or partially a remote operator, in order to allow wider range of operations, allow longer durations, or to be jamming resistant. And the last point is that especially the trend of using cheap, massive operations of especially airborne unmanned vehicles like drones, which we see in Ukraine, where you have off-the-shelf small consumer devices, which just a few chips burned on them, that are able to image recognition, and then track and engage targets. But that's for now from my side. Looking forward to your questions, and handing over to Elisabeth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reinhold, for giving an overview of the different technologies, and in particular, the military applications that currently exist and those that might be forthcoming. So indeed, I join you in handing the virtual microphone to Dr. Hoffberger-Pippan for a more legal perspective.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and I'm very happy to be here today at this important event. I have prepared more slides than I can probably cover, so I have to apologize in advance. I will probably have to rush through a couple of slides, but I wanted to give you a brief overview of the most pertinent legal challenges that arise when we talk about battlefield AI in more general terms. Dr. Reinhold has already talked about the technical implications when we talk about artificial intelligence on a battlefield, and also from a legal perspective, it really makes sense to put the term battlefield AI or military AI respectively into three different categories, so that we can better orient ourselves. AI, for example, can be directly built into a weapon system, and then it can be endowed with the task of selecting and engaging a target, a military target, without the need for further human input. In this case, we're talking about an autonomous weapon system where discussions on their potential regulation has been taking place for more than 10 years now, and many of you know that progress has been made so far, but only little one, and the challenges in this regard are very severe, to be frank. When we talk about artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence which has been built into a weapon system, it is not necessarily the case that all software components are endowed with the task of selecting and engaging a target without the need for further human input. Artificial intelligence could also play a different role. It could, for example, be endowed with the task of analyzing sensor data, such as video imagery, radar data, or video imagery, and then analyze these data and provide recommendations to the human operators. In this case, it makes more sense to refer to AI in this case as a decision support system. But nevertheless, in this case also, it could raise severe humanitarian law questions, and thus we also need to look at the use of AI in this context as well. My colleague has already referred to AI, which has not necessarily been built into a weapon system itself, but it could also be placed somewhere externally, even on a cloud, for example. So AI can also be used in a broader context, for example, as a decision support system that has not been built into a weapon system. A very classical example in this regard is the so-called multi-domain combat cloud. The multi-domain combat cloud forms an integral part of the future combat air system. And on that cloud, different military data are stored, and different stakeholders which are involved in military decision-making processes can interact with each other and then adapt their military decisions accordingly. And at a lower level, AI can also play a substantial role when it comes to logistics. For example, it is really important to have your logistics under control from a military perspective. However, when it comes to humanitarian law, we can say that the use of artificial intelligence for logistical purposes does not raise as many legal questions as when we talk about, for example, about autonomous weapon systems or decision support systems. So all in all, this is more or less a very brief summary of what we're actually talking about when we talk about the use of artificial intelligence on a battlefield of tomorrow. This picture has been taken also from the homepage of the Future Combat Air System, and it really shows us what is actually at stake. Different platforms are interconnected, ground vehicles, aerial vehicles, but also, for example, naval vessels. They can communicate with each other, or this is at least the overall object and purpose of integrating systems and making them even more interoperable to achieve specific military goals, such as, for example, reducing the timer to shooter, the distance between the shooter and the military target, and also to make systems more interoperable and to respond to military threats more quickly and, of course, more efficiently. When we now look at humanitarian law in particular, there are many legal questions that arise. And today I would like to focus primarily on one provision that is really important. It is Article 36, Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Convention, which foresees that in the study, development, acquisition, and so on of a new weapon, means, or methods of warfare, states parties to Additional Protocol 1 need to make sure that these weapons, means, or methods of warfare comply with humanitarian law, that there is no arms control treaty, for example, prohibiting the use of that particular weapon system, and even human rights might play a role in this regard. So Article 36 really plays a substantial role. When we look at the terminology of Article 36, you can see that Article 36 refers to weapons on the one hand, but also to means and methods of warfare on the other hand. And coming back to the first slide, when we talked about AI and how it can be built or not be built into a weapon system, we need to realize that sometimes artificial intelligence, for example, when we talk about the future, about the multi-domain combat cloud, artificial intelligence does not necessarily have to be built into a weapon system. But nevertheless, it might provide recommendations to human operators, which might have relevance for their military decision-making processes in more general terms. And there have been discussions going on whether such decision support systems, whether they have been built into a weapon system or whether they function externally. The questions have been going on whether such decision support systems should also fall under the purview of Article 36, Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. And some commentators argue that, yes, this is the case. Decision support systems, AI-enabled decision support systems, should fall under the purview of Article 36 weapons reviews obligation, because, or in case some requirements are fulfilled, such as that such a decision support system has a significant impact on the military decision-making process in more general terms and really affects the offensive capabilities in a military operation. So here you can see that discussions have been going on, and I would say that there is a trend to argue that Article 36, Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, not only covers typical weapons, that is to say platforms, and sometimes AI is of course included, so also software is included, but also decision support systems, which might play a role externally and which might nevertheless impact weapons per se. Another question that is still relevant, of course, is whether Article 36, Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions reflects customary law. Because many of you know that not every single state in this world has ratified Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, and it's still the prevailing view in the literature that Article 36 is not reflective of customary law. However, there are some authors who argue to the contrary, and it is also important to note that during the last GGE in 2024 this year, in March this year, some states argued that Article 36 is reflective of customary law. So here I just wanted to show you that there are different opinions as regards to normative reach of Article 36. And as I said, some states and some legal commentators argue that it is reflective of customary law, but the prevailing view still is it's not reflective of customary law. But speaking about states which have not ratified Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, this does not necessarily mean that these states have not any kind of weapons reviews. On the contrary, the United States, for example, has put in place a very rigorous review process, and it is really important also to share information, for example, and how weapons reviews are being undertaken in case artificial intelligence plays a role in the context of military operations. Another aspect that we also should look at is, of course, human rights law. Many of you might have noticed that when we talk about artificial intelligence and human rights, there has been a lot of engagement in the last couple of months and years. And some legal commentators argue that human rights law also needs to be taken into consideration when undertaking weapons reviews, when undertaking legal reviews. That's a more broader term, which might also cover artificial intelligence, of course. And one legal argument why this is the case is that the Human Rights Committee, it's more or less the treaty body of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Human Rights Committee has adopted General Comment number 36 on the right to life, and the Human Rights Committee has argued that states parties to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights need to undertake so-called preventive impact assessments. And some legal commentators again argued, okay, this also means that in case states want to study, develop, acquire, and even transfer weapons, then they need to also assess this process from a human rights perspective. So that means there is an entanglement between the obligation to undertake a review and also their respective human rights obligations. Speaking about artificial intelligence and the obligation to undertake weapons reviews more specifically, means that we need to be aware of the fact that decision support systems are arguably covered by the obligation to undertake reviews. That's one very important aspect. There are still many discussions going on, but we can rest assured that the trend seems to go in the direction that decision support systems are covered. Another aspect that my colleague has already touched upon is, of course, the so-called black box phenomenon of artificial intelligence and the issue of in situ learning algorithms. So when you use artificial intelligence, for example, artificial intelligence that has been built into a weapon system, it might be very challenging for reviewers to really assess whether this weapon system can be used adequately and in line with humanitarian or also human rights law. In situ learning algorithms, they can change and adapt to their environment continuously. And the so-called black box phenomenon of AI means that, for example, these kind of deep neural networks that my colleague has talked about, they cannot be explained in a way that they can be fully understood, not yet at least. And especially for lawyers, it might be very challenging to really understand what explainable AI actually means. So the entire buzzword that we are currently talking about, explainable AI or XAI, it's not really a game changer, but we really need to be aware of the fact that when technical experts talk about explainable AI, it might mean something very different for lawyers, for example. So this is what I wanted to highlight here when we talk about legal reviews, when we talk about an entire review process, it does not necessarily mean that only lawyers might be involved in the process of reviewing a weapon system that might be based on AI, but it might involve other stakeholders and other experts as well, especially ethicists, but also, of course, people with technical expertise, because the entire black box phenomenon is something that needs to be addressed at an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary level, and lawyers alone might not be able to tackle these challenges. Now I need to rush through the slides a bit. I just wanted to highlight that normally when we talk about weapons reviews and Article 36, targeting law is not necessarily part of a review process. However, when we talk about AI, many legal commentators have argued that targeting law also needs to be an integral part of a review process. And when we talk about targeting law, I just wanted to remind you that there are certain principles that need to be adhered to when battlefield AI is used that might raise questions from the perspective of humanitarian law. We're talking about the principle of distinction and the related prohibition of indiscriminate attacks. We're talking about the principle of proportionality, and we're also talking about the obligation to take precautions in attack. In case you're interested, I'll be happy to share the slides with you. So I will just want to highlight that these principles, these obligations exist, and that they might also play a role in the context of a weapons review within the meaning of Article 36. Just very briefly, again, the role on human rights and weapons reviews, or human rights and battlefield AI in more general terms. Just a brief reminder that human rights will certainly play an even bigger role in the future, even in the context of military AI. Let's assume, for example, you use an aerial vehicle, an unmanned aerial vehicle, which is based on artificial intelligence, and it can identify potential targets by using biometric data. We're not only talking about data protection law in this regard, but we're also talking about other rights, such as the right to life or the prohibition from torture or inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. So here we will very much talk about the potential extraterritorial applicability of human rights law, such as, for example, the European Convention of Human Rights, but there are also many other international regional human rights treaties which might be relevant in the future when we talk about battlefield AI. I just want to touch briefly on this issue, but I'll be glad to answer more questions in this regard in the Q&A session. Last but not least, we should address the issue of the term meaningful human control. Many of you know that meaningful human control has been the buzzword, so to say, in the UNGGE on lethal autonomous weapon systems in the past years. The majority of the states parties have endorsed this term. Other states are more reluctant or have favored other terms, such as, for example, the term human judgment or sufficient level of human judgment, and so on and so forth. But we can say that meaningful human control really has been the term that has also been endorsed, for example, by the majority of civil society representatives, academia, and many, many states parties in the GGE. When we talk about artificial intelligence in broader terms, so we're not talking about autonomous weapon systems and meaningful human control, but we should also ask ourselves, what would be the adequate term to describe the relationship between humans on the one hand and artificial intelligence in the military realm on the other hand? And then we can see that meaningful human control might not be the ideal word, but there are other words that might be more relevant in the future. And now we're coming to the so-called political declaration on the responsible military use of artificial intelligence and autonomy, which has been presented by the United States at the RIEM summit last year in the Netherlands, in The Hague. And the declaration has been endorsed so far by more than 52 states. It's a legally non-binding document. It provides guidelines on how states can use artificial intelligence and autonomy responsibly. And there are different principles that can be found in this political declaration. And there is one specific principle that we should really look at. It's Principle J, which foresees or which stipulates that states should implement appropriate safeguards when, for example, using autonomy or artificial intelligence in the military realm. And what we can see here is that the term safeguards seems to be the buzzword now, or the word to describe the relationship between humans on the one hand and artificial intelligence and autonomy, respectively, on the other hand. And when you look at the literature and the different commentators that have more or less written about the political declaration and the term safeguards in this respect, they have argued this is a good idea to have something pretty tangible, because installing or foreseeing safeguards, for example, so that the system can abort mission in case the potential target turns out to be a civilian object. This is something that states can really work with. And it really is also reflective of Article 57 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Convention, which also establishes a requirement to take precautions in attack, which inter alia entails an obligation to abort mission in case an object turns out to be a civilian one and not a military one. So here you can really see that maybe the relationship between humans on the one hand and AI in more broader context also needs to be described. And here you can see that the political declaration has been an important stepping stone in this regard. Some even argue that this could be the beginning of the formation of a norm of customary law, provided that both elements, usus and opinio juris, are met. We're not at this stage yet. It has only been endorsed by 52 states, but we can see that there is a clear willingness and commitment to endorse these principles. Thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to the questions and your comments in the aftermath. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a lot of material to go through in a short amount of time. So perhaps we can unpackage some of those elements during the Q&A, because there is a lot happening and a lot of considerations being made on the legal front. So thank you very much for giving a nice overview of all of that. We will now turn to the ethical perspective. So Dr. Blanchard, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction. And also thank you for having me here today. And thank you to my colleagues, Thomas and Elisabeth, for providing such a strong ground for me to kind of continue with. So I'm going to talk about the ethics today of military AI. It's a huge field. It's a big area of concern. So what I'm going to give is a kind of a sort of a brief overview of a few initiatives to do with the ethics of military AI, but also I'm going to start by kind of digging into how we actually think about the ethics of AI. So this is going to be more of a kind of a quick stop across a few different things. I'll draw on some of the research I've been involved with as I do this. So I think it's important, not impossible. It's very possible, and it's important to make sure we're on the same page when we think about ethics. So it's always good to begin with a definition. So there's a lot of different definitions of ethics, and I've cobbled together one myself here, which is that ethics is the study of moral phenomena. It investigates what people ought or ought not to do, and what justifications can be given for such claims. What I think it's worth bearing in mind is this point about justifications for claims about right and wrong. So the language of ethics has creeped into a lot of kind of international policy debate on AI, military AI, and particularly on autonomous weapon systems. For those who pay attention to the conventional, certain conventional weapons group of governmental experts. But when we're talking about ethics, we're talking really about the study of morals. So it's about working out what is right and wrong in a specific situation. And often what you're doing with ethics is you're trying to weigh up competing values, and you're trying to work out how to navigate a way through those competing values, particularly when circumstances change, because perhaps you get new technologies which change the way things are done, or pose new questions, or shake things up, and we need to kind of go back to these traditions we have for thinking about right and wrong. So that's what ethics is. And the picture there is the frieze that you can find in the Vatican. Raphael's The School of Athens, Aristotle and Plato, who kind of provide a lot of the kind of ethical traditions that we draw on when we're thinking about AI ethics. It's also worth clarifying the relationship between ethics and governance and regulation, because this is something worth clearing up in itself, and it's something that often gets mixed up in the policy debate, actually. So the regulation is rules elaborated and enforced through social or governmental institutions to regulate the use of technology. And the governance of, let's say, AI in this case, is establishing policies, procedures, standards for the management and development and use of technology. So they're complementary, but they don't exactly overlap. And what we're trying to do with ethics is we're trying to provide a sort of reflection on how we go about regulation and governance of technologies. In the end, you're unlikely to get an ideal ethical situation. So if we think about, for instance, debate that's going on autonomous weapon systems, and whatever regulation or regulatory approach comes out of that debate, it's likely to be as much a compromise between state interests and strategic interests and sort of tactical and operational concerns as much one of ethics. So ethics provides us with that standpoint to reflect on our regulatory discussions and what we're doing to govern technologies, but it's they're not always going to overlap. So how do we think about the ethics of military AI? As I suggested when we started out the presentation, it's a huge area of concern, and there's lots of considerations to take on board. So a piece of research I was involved in was how do we kind of break down and start to categorize and work out ways that we can apply ethical judgments to military AI. So firstly, it's best to think about breaking the uses of AI down into the purpose of use. There's kind of two reasons for doing this. Firstly, when we're thinking about the ethics of AI, we want to abstract from some of the technical particularities of these systems. So we may not be interested in the particular statistical method that is being used in an AI system, but we're more likely, or we're less likely to be interested in, say, the way in which it's built into particular hardware. The reason why we focus on purpose is because purpose is more durable. And also, AI technologies are malleable, they're dual use. So if we focus on purpose, that's likely to give us a constant going forward. And thinking about purpose is likely to shape the way in which AI is going to be employed in the future. So this kind of gives us a stronger ground to think about. So in this research I was involved in, we broke down the uses of AI into sustainment and support uses. So that's things like logistics and situational awareness. The second category was adversarial and non-kinetic uses. So that's AI for cyber defense and offensive cyber operations, and then adversarial and kinetic uses. So there's the classic in there, lethal autonomous weapon systems. But as Elisabeth has pointed out, there's also AI for the use of decision support. So once we've broken down the purpose of military AI, we can then start to think about how different ethical considerations apply to these uses. And what we have here is that once we move rightwards across this graph, the ethical challenges associated with that particular use of AI become more complex. So as we move rightwards, each list inherits the previous list. So for instance, if you have sustainment and support uses of AI, you need to use that stuff or develop it in a way which kind of conforms with existing AI ethics. So that's transparency and fairness, human autonomy, and the protection of human rights. As we move rightwards and we think about adversarial non-kinetic uses, some additional considerations come in. So thinking about distinction of targets and meaningful control, and the avoidance of escalation and creation of instability. And then as we move to the furthest right and we have adversarial and kinetic uses, we have even more kind of ethical requirements, which is that use of AI has to be consistent with just war theory or military virtue, perhaps a respect for human dignity, and to foster kind of post-balance stability. So that's a way of categorizing uses of AI, and to apply a kind of framework for thinking about different ethical considerations, because otherwise, if we don't do that kind of groundwork and lay those foundations, then the ethical considerations and our thinking can shoot off in all different kind of directions. So what I want to touch on is just one way that has evolved for addressing the ethics of military AI. Now, I could have gone in two directions here. One direction would have been to think about the role that ethics has been playing in the international policy debate. That's certainly an interesting area and an area requiring a lot more research. But the direction I want to take us in now, just for a couple of slides, is to think about how some states, and in particular their military organizations, have sought to meet or deal with the ethical concerns that have arisen around military AI. So that approach we can call the principles-based approach. And that effectively is about drawing up sets of AI ethics principles, which are meant to guide the procurement, development, and deployment of AI to make sure it's in conformity with moral frameworks. So the idea of taking a principles-based approach to AI ethics is it's not something specific to the military. Lots of corporations and companies and organizations have developed sets of AI ethics. In fact, there's lots of sets of AI ethics, and perhaps you've heard of one or two sets of them. So it's an approach that's been taken in the civil domain. So this was some research that UNIDA undertook, and they looked at sets of AI principles that have been adopted by different states or nations in the civil domain. And overall, there was 26 different sets. So it's a growing area of addressing AI ethics. There's not been so many sets of AI ethics principles developed in the military domain. So the first to go ahead and do this was the US Department of Defense, and their Defense Innovation Board published a set of responsible AI principles in 2020. Then you had the UK Ministry of Defence in 2022, and its Defence Science Technology Laboratory did some research on AI ethics principles in 2021. The Australia Defence Science Technology Group published some in 2021. So, and then NATO published its principles of responsible use in 2021 as well as part of its AI strategy. So with the NATO publication of its principles, that incorporates quite a large number of states and different defense ministers from the alliance signed up to those principles. So actually, there was quite a lot of countries that are in some way beholden to a set of AI ethics principles for the responsible use of those technologies. Apart from NATO, there's clearly a language bias going on here. I've checked with colleagues, and this seems like a correct list, and we've not found any more beyond this set of countries. It probably reflects a certain understanding, perhaps in English-speaking states, about what ethics is and what ethics entails. So I think there's something there. There's probably also a reflection about the fact that these are militaries with more resources to spend on doing this work. So that's just something to bear in mind in the way in which when we think about which states and military organizations are publishing these principles. But there is convergence. So I've taken a sample here from the US Department of Defense, the UK MOD, and NATO, and the principles for the responsible use of AI tend to converge with each other. So there's usually a principle around responsibility, ensuring accountability and responsibility for the use of AI. There's usually a principle that you find around equitable or bias mitigation, harms mitigation, the sense that the use of these technologies should be fair. There's usually a principle around explainability and traceability. The use of these systems, you should be able to trace them, see what they're doing, and you should be able to explain their behaviors. There's always a principle around reliability, and then there's a principle around governability. In a sense, you have to be able to control these systems. NATO kind of ruins this lovely symmetry by including lawfulness. But that's a little different there. I don't really have time to go into that. So that's what the approach that states and certain intergovernmental alliances have taken. And there is a problem with this approach, though, in that it doesn't provide directives for moral action. So this is a quote here. I haven't provided the reference, unfortunately. But the principle-based ethics provide limited insights into how to ensure that the principles are being met in practice, as they primarily focus on what rather than the how of AI ethics. So this is kind of where we've arrived at the moment. States have gone out and their military organizations have developed principles for the ethical use of AI, but the next step isn't clear. We don't really know what to do about implementing these principles and making them work in practice. There have been some attempts, though, at working this out. So the Australian Defence Science Technology Group published a method for ethical AI in defence, and the US DoD Defense Innovation Unit published responsible AI guidelines in practice. And what these provide is a set of questions and flow diagrams that actors in these organizations have to follow when either they're procuring AI, developing it, or thinking about using it, mostly around procurement at this stage. And the idea is that they follow these flow diagrams, these charts, and they ask these questions, and that should help them, or at least prompt them, to procure or develop AI in conformity with their organization's ethics principles or certain principles of responsible use. So there are some efforts in how we get from the principles into the practice. There was a limitation with taking a kind of a questions-based approach to applying principles, in that what is required to apply ethics principles is a certain amount of expertise around AI ethics. There's expertise required in all sorts of ways, about how around the implementation of an AI program, or thinking about the lawfulness of a system as you're developing it. But to apply ethics principles, there has to be some sort of ethical expertise in the organization to do so. So a sort of methodology presented by these two approaches, it risks putting a lot of work on a sole agent or individual who may not have the expertise and who assumes all responsibility for applying principles, even if they're not particularly sure how to do it. So there's a risk there about not having the expertise in place or the institutional processes and procedures to make sure that ethical outcomes are achieved. So looking forward, if we want to have the kind of ethical governance of AI, and if we want to make sure these AI ethics principles are actually usable, it becomes a sort of institutional question. Do defense institutions, organizations, ministries, do they have the right frameworks and governance processes in place to make sure they can procure and develop and use AI in a way that is ethical? So part of what is required for that is shared standards across defense organizations. So in some work I did, some research, we looked at different life cycle models across the NATO alliance, and we found that different defense organizations use different life cycle models of the AI system. So that can lead to incompatibility when doing risk assessments, and it can lead to distrust. Military AI governance requires accountability frameworks. It requires multi-stakeholder involvement. It needs auditing frameworks and assurance requirements, and it needs frameworks for transparency and traceability. And a lot of this will just require, I think, adapting existing governance frameworks that are already in place for defense capabilities. But some of it may require doing something new, because you're going from classical deterministic technologies to non-deterministic, and that can change things. So thinking forward, I'm kind of interested in how the work that's been going on to think about the ethical governance of AI within defense organizations, how that can be used to help states meet the commitments they're making in the kind of international sphere. As Elisabeth pointed to the Declaration on Responsible Use of AI, how can governance mechanisms feed into that to help states comply with that? There's also bigger questions about what role ethics is, or can, or should be playing in the international policy debate, and what it offers above existing legal and regulatory frameworks. So those are two questions I'm kind of just leaving out here as a place to go for new research. But that's all I wanted to say today. As I said, the ethics in military AI is a huge area. It's I just wanted to take a kind of a brief overview of how you can think about this area, and also one particular initiative that's been taken to address the ethics and by states in this area. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for providing the ethical perspective, as well as really digging into kind of where we stand in that current debate and what certain countries have already done in that regard. I'm going to take a moment here just to remind all of our participants that if you would like to submit a question to our panelists, if you are joining us on Zoom, please do so via the Q&A function, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen. And if you are joining us via the YouTube live stream, please submit your questions to events@vcdnp.org. To kick off the discussion, though, I have a very broad question that I'd like each of our panelists to address from your perspective that you presented, be it the technical, legal, or ethical. And that is, when you view AI, the current state, as well as the potential future applications of it, what do you see as being the greatest risks and being the greatest benefits when applying it to the military domain? You've touched on this a bit in your remarks, but if you could really just maybe pinpoint a couple of examples for our audience to get the discussion going, that would be really interesting for me to hear, and I'm sure for our audience as well. So would anyone like to address this question first? Shall we start with the legal perspective? Perfect, thank you.
And please, Thomas, you would like to go first, because that would... Okay, I'll make the jump start. Yeah, I think it's. I wanted to take notes first, in order to answer your question, but I think that the fast responses are probably the even better. I think that the greatest risk when it comes to AI, battlefield AI, is that there seems to be quite like an over-reliance on testing and evaluation of certain systems, thinking that we need to test them, and then we continuously test them, and then at one point in time we will be able to use AI in line with, for example, humanitarian, ethical, and also military and political and security and considerations. And I think that this is certainly a very important approach, but on the other hand, I think that we should also certainly identify red flags and red lines that should not be crossed. And I think identifying those red lines will be, of course, the most crucial thing. So I think this kind of over-reliance on thinking, yeah, just testing and evaluation will lead us where we want to end up one day, might be a bit of a kind of an optimism that I cannot entirely share, but it is, of course, very important. And then bias mitigation will, of course, be very, very important. Also, when we want to identify those red lines or just kind of red flags. And the biggest advantage when it comes to battlefield AI, in my point of view, is, of course, that we can certainly or hopefully save the lives of soldiers by, so to say, dehumanizing warfare, by reducing the numbers of soldiers being physically present on a battlefield. That is something that we can hope for. On the other hand, we can also see on the other side of the medal that we need to take a lot more care about the civilian population. So we can also see, of course, the target identification increases the risk for civilians being potentially harmed by military operations. So all in all, I think the greatest risk is, of course, this kind of over-reliance on testing and evaluation, and the biggest advantage might be that we can save the lives of soldiers, hopefully, and of course increase the speed of decision-making and respond to adversaries faster and in a more efficient way, and thereby create a military advantage that we might certainly need at one point in time, unfortunately, in the future.
Thank you very much for jumping in and given the short amount of thinking time I provided for that. Next, we'll maybe turn to Thomas, and maybe if you could, in the same instant, also perhaps address the question that has been submitted, whether you think military commanders would ever completely transfer authority to autonomous weapon systems to engage targets in the future. If you can add that question to the bit, perhaps you see that as a risk or a benefit or not even possible, but it'd be great if you could answer that as well.
Yeah, thank you for the question, because it plays right into my my answer. I'd like to start with the advantages, and I will follow here what Elisabeth said, but only from military perspective, because from peace research perspective, even from a technical perspective, I think bringing AI into military systems will end up in a lot of problems we probably never solve. What I mean here is that Elisabeth and I already talked about, we do have technologies to make AI explainable, to somehow unravel the black box AI, to make it understandable, to make it a little bit more transparent for human operators. But the real problem is here that the promise of AI is getting more speed in decision makings. And this is one of the drivers why military forces like to use AI systems in their decision support process, for instance. So when you then come with ideas to somehow make AI explainable, that always means reducing the performance of the AI. So even if we will have in near future technologies at hand to make them explainable, to open the black box, this will always have a weak position in arguing why we'd like to have these systems. And one of the risks is, and that's placed into the question in the Q&A session, and the Q&A part is that the possibilities for human decision makers to understand what the AI actually has done. So my vision, or my example here always is, if you have a battlefield management systems, and we commit to meaningful human control via the rule that the final decision has to be done by a human operator, for instance, then it probably has a system, and the system gives him reds and blue dots on a screen, and blue are your own soldiers, reds are the foreign forces. Then the system the AI in the background has done so many filtering processes, so many small and micro decisions. Why in the end it says these are red dots, these are blue dots. That this whole process is hardly understandable for the one that decides, okay, we engage the red ones and we leave all the blue ones. And this is the risk. And in many papers, it's usually called trust. If you trust the decisions of the AI, and I think the risk is that we will have trust in the decisions of AI, regardless of understanding why and how these decisions has been made. So I hope, and this is the answer to the question in the QA part, I truly hope that we will refrain from handing over the decision-making part to AI. And I really hope that we will refrain from using too much AI in filtering all this information. I hope this answers the questions.
No, that was a very, very comprehensive answer. So thank you very much. We'll turn to Alexander now to provide your inputs, and then we'll turn to more questions from the Q&A.
Thanks, Mara. Yeah, okay, so it's a good question. I'll start with the benefits one. I think I would turn the question back round on you and ask whose benefits, who's going to benefit from this use. Obviously, what I hope is that the key benefit is going to be a reduction in the humanitarian costs and the humanitarian impact of war. But I just don't know yet whether the benefits of AI have been proven or have been demonstrated. I think that's still something that needs to be demonstrated. Partially that's because I think we're still at an early stage of integrating new AI technologies into military and into military use. But I think there's still a while before the benefits are demonstrated. The second thing is I think the biggest risk is unintended consequences that result from using these systems. It's not just that AI is a non-deterministic technology, but it's also that with any new technology, when you're using it, it takes a long time to become accustomed and habituated to what it can do. So I think there's an immediate risk of just users of these systems not being aware of the consequences they're going to generate. And it may be difficult to reasonably foresee what these systems are going to do. And I think that's particularly acute with AI systems because they don't fail predictably, they fail unpredictably. So that's what I see as the biggest risk.
Thank you very much. I'll have to quote you on that. They don't fail predictably, they fail unpredictably. I think that's a very good point and perfect language for that. We're going to turn to some of the Q&A questions, and a lot of people are actually very curious about what's happening on the international sphere to regulate kind of military AI. And so I'm going to combine a couple of questions together and then get your perspectives. One is when we're looking at both the ethical debate and the responsible use of AI in the military domain, are these discussions supported by the debates going on at the CCW, or could they actually be counterproductive and maybe preventing a legal framework? In addition to that, there was also mention of the UN General Assembly resolution that was adopted. And one part of that resolution actually asked the Secretary General to obtain the views of member states on kind of artificial intelligence, in particular autonomous weapon systems. And what should come next with regard to these measures? How could we build on that particular momentum? So I know this is mainly more geared towards both Alexandra and Elisabeth, but Thomas, please come in as well. But first, I'll turn to Alexandra. Elisabeth, would you like to go first?
I'm happy to give it a go. It's a tough question. I mean, I wouldn't say that the discussion on ethics is going to be is counterproductive to what's going on in forums such as the CCW, GGE. What I don't particularly see yet is how, given the direction it's going with the two-tier approach and also with the focus on safeguards and safety, which is a kind of a more technical focus, I'm not sure I see a way in which ethics fits into that debate just yet. And I think there needs to be kind of more work done to think about the ways in the past that moral and ethical considerations have kind of inflected legal debate. That's certainly more thinking that needs to be done there. And I think also part of an approach that needs to be taken is that I think what we tend to have at the moment is a top-down approach to thinking about the ethics of these systems. So, you know, we'll often have perhaps interventions at the UN which kind of begin with asserting a norm and then try and work out the ethical argument that follows on the back of that. So you build the ethics to support the norm that is desired, whereas actually it may be best to kind of begin from working out the ethical arguments in detail and making sure they're coherent and trying to build them up and then seeing what possible norms can come out of that. So there's probably I would characterize the approach that's being taken at the moment as maybe top-down, whereas there needs to be a bottom-up approach. That's what I would say on that question.
Thank you. Elisabeth, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's a great question because, or I would like to address the answer to this question from a political, and then also I try to answer this from an ethical perspective. I think, first of all, I thought that the whole discussion about responsible AI might, create benefits for the GGE, and there might be kind of room for cross-fertilization. But on the other hand, to be very honest, I sometimes have the impression that the focus on responsible AI might also be intentional to kind of overshadow the discussion about the meaningful human control, human-machine interaction, and so forth. So now it's not about prohibiting certain weapon systems because they cannot be used in line with humanitarian, ethical, and security considerations. And now the focus seems to shift to the responsible use of AI, which presumes that it can be used in reality. And it's not so much about prohibiting certain particular kind of technology, but more or less finding guardrails how to use that kind of technology responsibly. That's what the terminology actually is all about. So sometimes I have the impression that the states which favor the concept of responsible AI want to shift the focus from the prohibitive aspects that have been endorsed by some states in the GGE to say, well, let's use AI responsibly and don't talk too much about prohibiting certain kinds of technology, because in reality, there are many states out there who want this technology to be used in reality on the battlefield. So I think sometimes I'm a bit, I wouldn't say critical about the whole responsible AI term, but it also might be another buzzword in the whole discussion. I don't think it might provide all the answers that we are looking for. There might be some answers, but I think it's kind of also shifting the focus away from very important things that we tend to forget. And now thinking about what Alexander has already said, and regarding the ethical dimension, it's also interesting to see or to observe that when we talk about the responsible use of AI, it's again, this entire focus is about, you know, this utilitarian approach to ethics. And in the GGE, there are so many states parties which endorse a different concept, the more deontological approach that we need to think about how we want to live as humans in more general terms. So, for example, Austria really wants to focus on the ethical dimension, not from a utilitarian perspective, but more from the perspective of, do we really want to, you know, delegate so many competences to machines? Is this what we want to be like as humans, as humans in this international in sphere? And the responsible AI discussion very much focuses on a different ethical concept, the utilitarian approach. So sometimes it's either or, and it would be really interesting to combine both approaches and really talk about the essence, how to combine and kind of interlink these approaches. But this is Alexander's expertise, but that's just what I was thinking about, that states in favor of responsible AI discussions very often focus or are very often in favor of a utilitarian approach towards AI and in the military realm, and that's interesting to observe. These are just my 2 cents in this regard.
Thank you very much. Thomas, was there anything you wanted to add on these particular issues?
Yeah, maybe just coming from the technical perspective, I fear that the discussions regarding responsible use of AI, regarding meaningful human control of AI, somehow is decoupled from actual technical developments, because AI companies are really pushing forward. It seems like every week there's a new release from OpenAI. So I fear that we will have in, let's say, 2 to 5 years, we will have these systems. We will have battlefield management systems, and I fear that it will be too late to somehow contain this development via rules, via norms. Although it might have been already also always a problem with new military technologies. Yeah.
That has sparked quite a reaction from your co-panelists. I am happy to give Alex and then Elisabeth a chance to add to what you've just contributed to the discussion.
Sorry, this was actually a point referring to something Elisabeth just said before, which was that it occurred to me that, I mean, the states, the kind of move towards the focus on either a legal approach to regulating autonomous weapon systems or the move towards the responsible military AI approach, is that when it comes to the ethics, I don't think it's so much that states don't want to engage with ethics and the fear that it might be prohibitive, but I think it's more that actually a lot of states don't really know what the ethics mean. You know, the arguments are kind of underspecified and in some sense still a little vague. And I think states are quite cautious about signing up to anything that they don't really know about. You know, and because the CCW is an instrument of IHL argument has been developed, you know, really quite in depth there about autonomous weapon systems. But I think states are still very uneasy about signing up to something that they just don't, that's just too vague and that they don't necessarily understand yet.
Elisabeth.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I just wanted to address the other question that was asked about the General Assembly, and that I would also briefly comment on Alexander and the Thomas statements. Regarding the General Assembly, I just wanted to make a brief comment. I think it is really interesting to see that the entire discussion about autonomous weapon systems in the GGE is kind of now surrounded by parallel developments also in the civilian realm when we talk about, for example, the EU AI Act or the developments that are taking place in the Council of Europe, for example. And I think not only the General Assembly, which specifically focused on autonomous weapon systems, but AI in more general terms, not only in the military realm, there are so many regulatory efforts. And this is also what we discussed last time. When we talk about, for example, the adoption of the EU AI Act, there are certain indicators, or actually, to be frank, very strong arguments that the EU AI Act applies to dual use technology that would also involve, of course, military technology that can be used in both ways, civilian and military dimensions. And what I want to say with this is that I think this is another wave of regulatory efforts that might also affect the UNGGE to a certain degree, and the way how we use military AI in more general terms in the future, because the regulatory efforts in the civilian realm are so fast and so strong, and they cannot be circumvented easily when we look at the EU AI Act and its scope, material scope of application, for example. So this is just what I wanted to say about the General Assembly, and kind of broaden this argument, or kind of have an even broader take on in this regard. And regarding Thomas' argument, just very briefly, I think when we talk about the industry and the developments that are taking place, I totally agree that the developments are so fast and that we cannot really keep pace with these developments. And that also aligns very well with what Alexander was saying. Sometimes states and even the industry doesn't really know what is actually demanded from them. So when you talk about, for example, a defense, I don't know, contractor, a private company who wants to undertake an ethics review, they hire people who have never done this before, and they don't even know what to do about that. And even lawyers don't know how to apply, for example, data protection, which has legal implications, but also many, many ethical implications in an extraterritorial context outside the scope of the European Union, for example, in a military realm. So what I want to say here is that there is so much uncertainty involved. And I think this is also like one of the biggest risks. What Thomas was saying is that the developments are so fast, and in the end, we don't really know when it comes to the details what is actually going on. And I think this is really challenging. So we definitely should involve private industry stakeholders more intensively and really tell them what they should do, because many of them really also want to know about it. They also don't want to, like jump into the cold water and just be tasked with an ethical analysis, and then, they should do whatever they can because they don't have the respective knowledge. I think there's still a lot of work that is needed. It doesn't really provide any answers, but I just wanted to share my views on this. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. This has brought in a very interesting discussion with more questions coming out of it. Thomas, I'm going to let you come in, and then we'll return to some of our questions before we wrap up, as our time is running a bit short. So Thomas, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to mention that the EU AI Act, as well as the last adoption of the UN for use of AI from last week, both explicitly exclude military use, regulating the military use. I think even in the EU resolution, it was cut down during the last discussion round. So there are definitely ways to go to find there somehow common ground. And I'd just like to mention regarding the regulation, what I see as a real probably a real showstopper here is that we have currently a strong a very heavy concentration of AI knowledge in US, maybe in Asia companies. So regulating it will always somehow handle the current situation that is already getting part of the international power play. Who owns this technology? Who can use it? It was has become very clear at the Munich Security Conference, where the CEO of OpenAI voted for we do need regulation, whereas the CEO of Palantir said we do need regulation, but not for us, only for every other every country. So I think it will be becoming quite complicated to somehow regulate it, also heavily needed.
Thank you very much. I'm going to package a couple of questions. We'll turn it back to you, and then we'll wrap up for concluding remarks. So, Elisabeth, you touched on the private sector and industry and the type of dialogue that has to happen there. And some questions have come up regarding how much is the industry engaged? How could we engage them in the conversation to make sure that they abide by some of the principles and best practices and recommendations that are being adopted at the state level? others can chime in on this as well. Another question overarching in all of this is, what is the role of civil society in this regard? What could civil society be doing more to push this conversation forward? And there's been a lot of questions on ethics that I will let Alexander tackle. In particular, a lot of people have taken note that the countries that have kind of put out ethical guidance are all Western countries. Can you speak a bit about global ethics regimes? Do they exist? Also taking into account that nations have very different ideas about what are ethical principles in their particular countries. So I will turn it back over to you, and then we'll follow with our wrap-up session. Elisabeth, shall we start with you?
Thank you so much. Yeah, just very briefly about the private industry. I think that it's just an interesting observation to see that in the GGE on laws, you didn't really see, of course, because it's just not usual, you don't see private industry engagement. They don't participate in meetings, for example, and they don't speak about their views on the use of artificial intelligence in the military realm. And this is actually unfortunate because I think, of course, there are also ethical considerations in case private industry stakeholders would suddenly participate in the GGE and then also have their influence, because this might be also very dangerous from a lobbying perspective. But their knowledge is definitely needed, and I think it's also really needed to look what they need to guarantee that the technology they develop can be used in line with ethical, legal, and security considerations. The other thing is, and this was also interesting, when you looked at the REAM summit that took place in the Netherlands last year, there was a lot of private industry engagement. And there were different views on that. There was one group of people who said, okay, this is super dangerous because this is just a lobbying event where people try to really, get into contact with industry stakeholders and then do their business there. I personally had also the impression that it was really important for people from academia, from think tanks, and so on and so forth, to talk to people from the private industry. You really need that kind of engagement because you need to get a sense of what is actually going on. And this is what Thomas was referring to, the developments, the technology that is out there. There needs to be knowledge about that so that we, from the civil society sector, from think tanks and so on, can respond accordingly. Of course, they cannot share all their knowledge and their details because it involves a lot of state security considerations that cannot be shared publicly, but I think active engagement is certainly needed. And then regarding this concept of self-regulation, because sometimes also in the military realm, people were thinking about whether private industry should come up with a self-regulation, and then others say this is kind of a greenwashing effort, so that a global norm should be developed, which includes norms for private industry stakeholders. And just one last thing, Article 36 weapons reviews, there's also discussion going on in the literature that this should also affect and be kind of or should not be binding for private industry stakeholders, but states should be obliged to include private industry stakeholders in their review processes so that all the stakeholders from the very beginning can be included to guarantee that weapons can be developed in line with all these considerations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Alexander, can we turn to you for some of the ethical questions?
Yeah, no, it's a well-made point. The principles that have been coming out so far have been mostly from Western nations. I think it may be a reflection of a certain understanding of ethics, a kind of a more analytical approach, but I also think it's a reflection of the capacity that is required to do this ethics research or do ethical governance of military AI. It's not something that can be done easily. It needs a lot of resources, a lot of time spent thinking about it, how you implement it, where you're going to go with it. So I think it may be as much a reflection of resources, but I think it's also being something that's been corrected, and it's becoming less and less a Western conversation now. And moving more into a kind of a global discussion of ethics. So you've had a few initiatives such as the Belém community that came out of a conference in Costa Rica last year. In a few months' time, there's going to be a conference in Sierra Leone and Freetown. South Korea have been involved in organizing REAIM along with the Netherlands. You've also had some active participation in the non-aligned movement. So I think it's a conversation that is changing that way and steering in a different direction.
Perfect. Wonderful. I do see we're short on time. Thomas, was there anything you wanted to say here before we turn to our concluding remarks? No. Okay, great. Then I'm going to take this opportunity to, first of all, apologize to all our participants whose questions we did not get to. But thank you so much for being actively engaged, and thank our panelists immensely for all of your contributions, especially all of the discussions. I've learned a great deal during this particular webinar, and will also be walking away with more questions, which seems to be the nature of this particular field at the moment. But what I would like to do is turn back to you, the speakers, for any concluding remarks or final comments. And one question that I do want to pose to Thomas that was in our Q&A that we hadn't addressed, should you choose to take it up in your concluding remarks, is the idea if military AI and applications could have verification measures embedded in the source code. If this is possible at the moment, to have the source code include risk reduction measures or verification measures. And if you want to expand beyond that, is there an appropriate fora that you see to date? This could be expanded to both Elisabeth and Alexander to answer as well, a specific fora you see today where transparency measures in source code could be discussed or not. With that, I think we'll take it in the order in which we started. So Thomas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this last very interesting question. Speaking as a computer scientist would say, of course it's possible. But the problem here is how we enforce it. Because as I already tried to explain, putting any kind of verification, putting any kind of safeguards, which Elisabeth talked about, into the source code always means reducing the capabilities of this AI, which will be seen as a disadvantage, especially when we're talking about gaining speed of decisions. So we really have to have a strong ground for arguing why we need this kind of extra code within the system. And then it's possible. There is research needed, but so far it looks good that we could establish such kind of making the AI actually meaningful, human controllable, to say so. And the points, my last thing I'd like to point out is, and I already mentioned in my talk, is which we haven't talked in the Q&A session, is that the whole AI debates will become even stronger in the next years, interconnected with the debates regarding supply chain security, regarding chips, and who is able to develop these systems, because these computers they're huge computers. They need very specific chips to operate the systems, to develop the systems. So this will heavily become interconnected more and more over the next years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Elisabeth, on to you.
Thank you so much. Just one brief response to what Thomas has said. I hope I can agree, because I don't have the expertise, but I certainly believe you. But I just wanted to say, when we talk about the entire process that is currently taking place, there seems to be a tendency to embrace, for example, confidence building measures, sharing of best practices in order to really create trust among states parties, especially in the GGE, but also outside the context of the GGE in more general terms. And this, on the one hand, sounds very promising. But on the other hand, and this is just a brief remark that I have at the end of the session, is when we look at the current geopolitical developments that are taking place, I really have my own doubts that confidence building measures and the sharing of best practices might be the ultimate solution to guarantee that battlefield AI can be used in line with humanitarian law and ethical considerations. Because I do think that, of course, there might be a coalition, so to say, of the willing, those states which want to use this kind of technology in line with all these considerations. We're certainly not only talking about so-called Western states, but there might be global efforts when we look, for example, as Alexander has already mentioned, efforts in various African nations, but also, for example, in Costa Rica and other states of the global south. There is certainly a willingness to do so, but I'm very I'm also kind of pessimistic regarding the creation of trust, because there are still states which would never oblige for any kind of confidence building measures, best practices. And I think every kind of verification regime also depends, of course, on the willingness of states to comply with their obligations. And international law is just that. It's in the end the willingness of states to adhere to international law, which sounds very sad, but I think that's kind of the political dimension attached to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on to you, Alexander.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll answer very quickly by circling back around to your first question to us about what is the biggest risk. And one of the risks is treating military AI as a technical issue, or treating it as foremost a technical issue. It's not a technical issue. It's a person problem. It's about making sure we have the institutions, the processes, the social organization, the political control to make sure these technologies are doing what we want them to do.
Well, thank you for having us end on that particular note. I would like to thank all of our panelists again for joining us for this webinar. Thank all of our viewers for joining us online, both via Zoom and YouTube. And we look forward to continuing these discussions at future VCDNP events focused on artificial intelligence. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.